I forgot to do my hair today.
Alright. So here's how this works. We will do this rather quickly. I'm not saying, if you have questions, please do ask. But we are going to move through this thing, rather quickly. This isn't much of a participatory affair. Alright. So your test is tomorrow, 65 questions. All of them will have 5 prompts, A through E. You'll have the entire class to do it. As we get a little further into the exams, then you will start to see the number of questions increase to what AP will ask you in May, which will be 80. But tomorrow we start a little bit slower. And again, remember, they are all actual AP questions, stuff that has been on the test before. All right. How did the Indians of eastern U.S. live? They lived in homes, in wooded areas. What AP will do, and you won't see this in tomorrow's test, but sometimes they'll ask you to compare our eastern woodland natives to that of like Great Plains. Great Plains are nomadic, but our eastern folks lived in homes and farmed. And, so just remember our eastern woodlands. The Iroquois League or Iroquois Confederacy, made up of 5 tribes, primarily in the New York region. And the significance about the Iroquois is they were either neutral when it came to dealings with the French and English, or sided with the English. So that's the big significance. Where most of the other natives sided with the French, the Iroquois were more neutral or British. Reformation. Reformation starts in Europe with Martin Luther trying to reform the church.
Are you doing the study guide? Or?
If you need one, there's one.
I have one.
And this is kind of what gets Henry VIII the grand idea to pass the Act of Supremacy in 1534. The Act of Supremacy is going to take England away from the Catholic Church and create the Church of England. And this is going to start your Protestant movement in England. If you were anything other than Anglican, you were going to be persecuted against, and at this point enter our Puritanism. The Spanish Armada in 1588. Under King Philip II, the Spanish Armada attacks the British in the English Channel. And the significance of this is this huge, crazy freak storm that shows up and wipes out most of the Spanish Armada. And the result of this is England believed that God was on their side, and therefore they become the ruler of the seas. Why did the colonists settle? Okay, English. The English come to the New World and settle for investment purposes. They come looking for a Northwest Passage, and also with our Puritans for a freedom of religion. Spanish are here for basically the 3 G's: gold, God, and glory. The French are looking for a Northwest Passage, and the French end up, as we know, establishing trade. Explorers where and for who? Prince Henry the Navigator was Portugal. He's the guy who's credited with starting the first navigation school to draw a navigator to Portugal in 1480. Bartholomew Diaz also sails for Portugal. In 1487, he's the guy who gets to the Cape of Good Hope, hits some crazy storm, and his crew threatens mutiny if he does not turn around, but he has at least seen that there is a water route to Asia. Vasco da Gama is the guy from Portugal who's going to take the same ideas as Diaz and go around the Cape of Good Hope and actually make it to India and return with salt. Christopher Columbus sails for Spain, 1492. Columbus sails the ocean. Looking for a westward route to Asia, and as luck would have it, bumps into a very, very large landmass, later gaining the title of founder of the Americas. John Cabot sails for the English in 1497, and his purpose was looking for a Northwest Passage. Ferdinand Magellan, sails for the Spanish in 1519, also looking for a western route to Asia. As he continues, he claims or finds the Pacific Ocean, names it Pacific because it is so calm, continues his venture, gets into a little bit of a political argument in the Philippines, gets himself killed, but the rest of his crew ends up making it back to Spain, giving the Spanish the title of the first who circumnavigated the globe. Jacques Cartier sails for the French in 1534. His motive was looking for a Northwest Passage. Cartier explores the St. Lawrence River and then establishes a fort near Henry Hudson. Hudson sails for both the British and the Dutch. And, looking for a Northwest Passage, ends up claiming and naming for himself both Hudson Bay and Hudson River. Coronado, Fern. It's right there. Where did I put Coronado? All right, put Coronado. Coronado sails for Spain in 1542. You really not there? Oh, it's just, there's a space. Sorry, I was looking at that as the next part. All right, Coronado sails for Spain in 1540, 1542, primarily looking for gold, this, El Dorado, lost city of gold. Coronado is going to explore our American Southeast, which at the time, the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, Texas. He's going to go as far as Kansas, far north as Kansas, where he's going to discover these monstrous beasts and come back with these tales of bison in Kansas. He's also, another crew of his is going to go as far west as Arizona and come back with tales of the Grand Canyon. And Champlain sails for the French starting in 1603. And again, Northwest Passage, and he ends up establishing trade routes along the St. Lawrence, Quebec, and establishing good relationships with the natives. The Treaty of Tordesillas, a treaty signed between the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Pope did not want to offend his two major contributors. And so as these two are coming into conflict with their lands of exploration, he draws this line in the ocean, this Treaty of Tordesillas, this line of demarcation, saying all settlements west of this line will be reserved for the Spanish, all settlements east of this line for Portugal, except east of this line was like this little tiny nub of Brazil. That's all Brazil got. But nonetheless, it was this idea to try and make sure you're not going to have conflict between your two major countries. Croatoan. All right. 1585, the British first attempt to settle the New World was on Roanoke Island off the coast of North Carolina. The first attempt was in 1585. We know that they sent all men, and very quickly thereafter these men all left the island of Roanoke. The second attempt is going to come in July of 87, and this is where they send, the number is about 114 men, women, and children to settle this. The leader is White, John White, and he has to go back to England looking for supplies. He gets stuck in the middle of this British and Spanish Armada battle and cannot leave England for a while, returns to Roanoke in 1590 to find has disappeared. All the colonists are gone. The buildings, the weeds have overgrown the buildings. He finds rusty armor and moldy books, and Croatoan carved on, a tree, carved on a door. And really, we have no idea what happened. So the British are not going to be very successful in their first attempts. The Huguenots. 1564, the Huguenots, or the French Protestants, try and establish a settlement near St. Augustine in Florida for religious purposes. The Spanish weren't too hip on the Huguenots being there and very quickly drove them out. Joint Stock Company, our first corporations. England was offering investment opportunities in the joint stock companies, the Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth. The Virginia Company of London is going to be the joint stock company that first settles Jamestown in 1607. The Virginia Company of Plymouth is originally going to try and settle a little further north and try in present-day Maine, and came back with nothing. The headright system, the Sir Sandys from England comes up with this way to recruit people to come to the New World and immigrate to Virginia. They stole the idea from the Dutch patroon system. The headright system was if you give a plot of land, and this plot of land was going to be 50 acres, you give 50 acres to each passage paid to the New World. Pay somebody's passage, you get land. That's a way to encourage people to come over here. And the big theme here is land. Land is everything. Land is your economic future. Land is your political future. Land is everything.
Will you repeat why they gave the 50 acres?
to try and recruit people to come over to Virginia. The joint stock company in Virginia needed to start turning more of a profit, and if you can encourage more people to come, they can start more farming and encourage or help out the investors. The quitrents. The quitrents are the property tax that they were going to be asked to pay on their head rights. Property tax. John Rolfe. In 1612, John Rolfe is a man who introduces tobacco into the Virginia colony. 5 years later, in 1617, is going to be the first shipment of tobacco from Virginia back to the Old World. That number was like 20,000 pounds, and as we know, it was very successful. The Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was signed in November of 1620. Long short, our Puritans were out of their jurisdiction, whether that be intentional or not. They found themselves out of their jurisdiction. So before stepping off the Mayflower, it was either 40 or 41 of the adult males aboard the Mayflower signed this agreement of majority rules. It's our first idea of democracy as established in the New World, majority rules. Puritans. Puritans are going to be part of this great migration that people are going to become, they term people coming from 1620 to 1640. There are three types of Puritans. There are separatist Puritans. Our Puritans who founded Plymouth, Massachusetts are of the separatist kind. They separated from the church. These are the purest of the pure, our Puritans, separatists. Congregationalists are going to be the ones that found Boston in 1630. These people waited a little bit longer before leaving England. They felt that they could reform the church from within, and then eventually realized that's not a reality, and ended up founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or our city on a hill. And Presbyterians were Puritans that came from Scotland, our Scottish Puritans. Saints. If you were in the Puritan society, you had to prove yourself to be a saint, or in other words, prove you had this religious conversion experience. And once you have been deemed a saint, then you could get the property qualifications, then you could be a part of the church, then you could vote. So in other words, in order to be part of this great democracy, you had to be deemed a saint. Predestination, part of the Puritan belief that God had determined where you were going before you were born. You were predestined. In other words, if you act like you're predestined, you're going to show everybody else within our Puritan societies that you are truly one of the chosen ones. Other beliefs of the Puritans. Okay, obviously refrain from sin. They established a covenant with God. They said it was illegal to live by themselves because you're only going to cause trouble. It was forbidden to celebrate Christmas.
Krista Seal Cabbage, would you please go to the library?
Parents were going to be held responsible for their children. You've got to love God first, then your spouse, then your family. And one of the big ones with the Puritans was literacy. They really stressed this idea of education. The old deluders on probably. The House of Burgesses, another way to recruit people to move to the New World. The House of Burgesses was established in Virginia in 1619 to give people political power. The House of Burgesses is going to be one part of the government in Virginia. You're going to have an appointed governor. Underneath the appointed governor, appointed by the crown, you're going to have a governor's council, which is appointed. But then right alongside the governor's council, you're going to have the House of Burgesses, or an elected legislative body. So that's the significance. It becomes the first elected legislative body. John Winthrop is the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He is going to create this Massachusetts Bay Colony as his city on a hill. Roger Williams is charged with heresy by the Puritans in 1636 and is excommunicated, booted. And he's the guy who claims that the church and state should be separated. So this what will become an American concept of separation of church and state. And he leaves and later founds Rhode Island, this colony based on complete religious tolerance. Anne Hutchinson. also one of our Puritan dissenters. Anne Hutchinson was this very, very intelligent Puritan woman, which is probably what got her into a lot of trouble. And she starts preaching the Word of God, or interpreting the Word of God, as was delivered by the ministers. In other words, it was a woman discussing theology. And the Puritan male congregation saints had serious problems with a woman doing the job of a saint. Hutchinson is banned from Massachusetts and later sets out for Rhode Island, where on her way she ends up settling and ends up getting killed in a Native American attack, her and most of her 14 children. Antinomianism. The people who followed Anne Hutchinson were called antinomianists. The word itself is Greek for against the law. Anne Hutchinson claimed that the truly saved, those who were truly saved by God, were exempt from all laws of man and all laws of God. You don't need laws if you are truly saved. So antinomianism, against the law. The General Court is the legislative branch of the Massachusetts government. The General Court may meet 4 times a year, and their job was simple: to make laws. In the beginning, all freemen were members, and then they started becoming a little more exclusive, and then it goes to the mid-1630s, the elected representatives were sent, and then by 1660 they had broken into a bicameral legislative branch, General Court. King Philip's War, 1675 into 1676. This was a war fought between the natives and the English colonists over land. This leads to the English starting, things like germ warfare that they'll later expand on, and leaving blankets with smallpox virus and this kind of thing. A lot of these early wars between natives and the colonists are going to be over land. As the colonists are expanding, they're expanding into native territory, and so the result is King Philip's War. Jeremiads. These are Puritan preachers who rallied with the church to say that society was becoming less pious. We're losing our religion, long short. They wanted to remind the Puritans that we were there for religious purposes, not for economic ones. So don't get too far away from our cause. Basically, they're like your old school Puritans who saw the new generation messing things up. Salem witch trials. All right, as women started to gain more political strength because they might have inherited land, as more women were becoming members of the church, women were becoming a threat. And one way to shoot down this threat is to set them on fire. If you call women witches, then it's their job, the women's job, to prove that they're not. Good luck with that. And so as a result, if anybody is trying to step on the toes of the men, you can call them a witch, prove they're not. If they can't, you burn witches at the stake. All in all, there were only 20. They didn't actually get to burning them. They hanged most of them, including a dog or 2. But it shows that women were gaining more political and economic power, and so the men were not about to allow this to happen. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This is the first written constitution in America. In 1639, as the Hartford Colony and the New Haven Colony joined and became Connecticut under the Fundamental Orders of. The halfway, yes,
What
sir.
are the two, Hartford and what?
New Haven. Hartford was founded by Thomas Hooker, and New Haven by Davenport, John Davenport. Halfway Covenant. In 1662, as the Puritan Church became more concerned with the fact that they were losing members because this conversion experience was very difficult, the Halfway Covenant tried to expand the church membership by opening up to people whose father, who may have been declared a saint. So you don't have to go through the whole sainthood conversion experience. If your descendant had been a saint, it makes you eligible. Now, you're only a halfway saint. You don't get full voting rights, but nonetheless, you can be a member of the church. And from this point forward, women were going to make up the majority of the congregations in the Puritan Church. And that is what is going to lead to our Salem witch hunts. Colonial rebellions, what did they have in common? Our colonial rebellions had in common the fact that they were going against their own government, anti-government. Bacon's Rebellion, Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy planter who had purchased some land in the Piedmont region in Virginia. The governor in Virginia, in Jamestown, wasn't about to send the militia out to protect these colonists because he didn't want to mess with this trade monopoly he had. Long short, Bacon and the boys end up storming Jamestown, going after the governor and burning Jamestown to the ground. In other words, it's your Westerners that were going after their Eastern government when they did not feel represented. Leicester's Rebellion, something similar is going to happen in New York, 1689, 1691. Jacob Leicester was pretty angry that the British were denying New Yorkers access to their ports, thanks to things like the Navigation Acts and such thing. Leicester's Rebellion is going to happen after this whole breakup of the Dominion of New England. And Leicester and the boys are going to be responsible for going after Governor Andros. And after Governor Andros is captured, he is going to try and take over and control some of these ports. In other words, did not feel that that government represented them. Leicester's New York. The Regulator Movement. Similar incident happening in North Carolina. Your subsistent farmers in western North Carolina are feeling like or claiming they're being overtaxed, and so they are going to go after your wealthy planter businessman elite in the east. Westerners going against the eastern government, not being represented. The Paxton Boys, a group of men in Pennsylvania in 1763 who were protesting the proclamation of 1763. They marched, there's like 600 of these fellas who marched on Philadelphia to protest this proclamation, or not allowing them to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Maryland Toleration Act. In 1649, the Maryland Toleration Act, or the Act of Religious Toleration, was supposed to guarantee political rights and religious freedoms to all Christians, making them the second colony to Rhode Island. Remember, Maryland was originally established as a haven for Catholics, but there were more Protestants there, so they tried to protect the Christians by saying, okay, everybody is going to be protected. Who settled in Piedmont? Mostly your former indentured servants, people who came with nothing, fulfilled their contract, had no land, moved west and squatted on land. Old Deluder Act, also known as the Old Deluder Satan Act in 1647. This is the first public school act passed in America. It shows that the Puritans were going to be very focused on education, requiring a school to be in every community in Puritan land, Massachusetts. The role of women in the colonies. New England, they had more of a domestic role. Women in New England really had virtually no independence whatsoever. I mean, that's going to start changing with the Halfway Covenant, but for the most part, domestic. Women in the Chesapeake. Now, women in the Tidewater in the Chesapeake basically ran the household. They oversaw the education of the slaves. I'm sorry, not the slaves. They oversaw the education of their children, and then they oversaw the health of the slaves. I guess they played nurse to the slaves, making sure the slaves were going to be healthy. Women in the Piedmont region were going to be more like that of New England. They're going to be more of this domestic role. You're welcome to sit down anyway. Okay, role of women. Indentured servants. Indentured servants were contracted workers who come to the New World, serve contracts from anywhere from 3 to 7 years. It was a way for people who didn't have anything in the old world to come and create some sort of opportunity for themselves in the new world. The indentured servants are going to make up the majority of your colonies until Bacon's Rebellion. Because a lot of the people in Bacon's Rebellion were old indentured servants. So the view was these old indentured servants could not be trusted anymore. So after 1676 in Bacon's Rebellion, you're going to see importation of more slaves. take a second and breathe. Shake your hands.
We didn't have this.
All right, that's good. Slavery. The slave trade is going to be started by Portugal in the 1500s. The first slavery we're going to see in the New World is in 1619, as tobacco is starting to take off in Virginia. The Royal African Company, Royal African Slave Company, is going to be the British monopoly on the African slave trade. This is James II. Who's going to make sure that this is going to stay in British hands. The Barbados Code, or the Slave Code passed in 1661 on the island of Barbados, giving basically the legal base for slavery. It established the idea that you've got to dress your slaves, but anything beyond that, well, you don't. Anything beyond that was going to be okay if it was in the nature of controlling your slaves. If you need to smack them around a little bit, that's okay because they're not really people. Harvard was founded in Massachusetts in 1636 to train ministers. And another effect of Harvard is you're going to get a really highly educated based colony in Massachusetts. Not only because of the old Deluder Act, but now you're going to get a college-educated base in Boston, leading to them stupid troublemakers. Think for yourself, and you're going to cause trouble. Religions by 1800. Generally speaking, we had a lot of different denominations, religious denominations in the New World, thanks to the Great Awakening, which itself was in response to the Enlightenment. So very religiously diverse. Where were there no tax-supported churches? The first one is Rhode Island, separation of church and state, and Pennsylvania is going to be founded on these same principles. AP loves to bring that one up, bless you, asking about the first religiously tolerant colonies. Pennsylvania and Rhode Island is almost always your answer. The Holy Experiment of 1670 was referring to Pennsylvania as a haven for Quakers. Quakers. Quakers are a break-off of our Puritans. They were actually called the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers were given their name by the other Puritans because of this religious, I don't know, what do we call it? I'm going to call that. Yeah, they were pacifists. They basically said everybody has an inner light. You don't really need a church. But very, very emotional with their services, we'll say. Inner light, again, that was the idea that everybody had the ability to communicate directly to God. This was a big threat to the Puritans, because the Puritans needed people coming to their church and paying their tithes, and this supported the government, and this supported everything. But when the Quakers say, you don't even have to go to church, that's a huge threat to the Puritans. Puritans and Quakers, not so much. Religious toleration. This is becoming an Americanism, thanks to places like Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, and then later Maryland and North Carolina. This idea is going to spread. Colonial exports. All right, the economic base in New England. You're going to get fish, timber, shipping. They are going to start distilling rum and producing rum and selling rum. Molasses is also going to start producing, selling, exporting molasses. Importing the sugar from the West Indies, producing molasses, etc. Middle colonies are going to be known as your breadbasket, grains and wheats and barley and lots of your foodstuffs. The southern colonies, in the Chesapeake region of Maryland and Virginia, your primary export is going to be tobacco. North Carolina is going to be primarily tobacco too. And then once you get a little further south into South Carolina, your main export is going to be rice. And then later, about 1740 or so, it's going to be indigo. Zenger, John Peter Zenger the John Peter Zenger case is going to establish this idea of freedom of the press. In other words, it redefines crimes like libel. It's only libel if it is untrue. So the press can print stuff that's going against the crown as long as it is true. Freedom of the press, Zenger. Colonial cities. as the New World becomes more focused on its economy and more focused on capitalistic ideals, the cities are going to be the ones that really start to develop and become the trade centers of all of the colonies. Who were the rich folks? Who had wealth in the colonies? In New England, it was your merchants, your shipbuilders. In the middle colonies, since these are our bread baskets, it's going to be your farm owners, and usually your larger farm owners, 100 to 200 acres or so. These are the people. The middle colonies are going to be the only ones. And of course, in the south, it's going to be your plantation owners, big plantation producing cash crops. The Dominion of New England. In 1686, King James II is going to revoke the charters of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island and form a big, fat super colony known as the Dominion of New England. He's later going to add New Jersey and New York to this. Get rid of this concept of self-government, get rid of Puritan influence here in the New World, and make sure that you have a governor that is going to be able to enforce the Navigation Acts. And that governor is Andros. Sir Edmund Andros was the governor of the Dominion of New England. After King James is forced to abdicate in England, Andros is captured by the colonists. And remember the story is he was wearing women's clothing and was only spotted because he was wearing boots. And so William and Mary asked the colonists to please ship Andros back to us. Don't do anything crazy with Andros. But Andros was not very well liked. The Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals in the New World from 1720 to 1740s. Very short time period, but it is a reaction to the Enlightenment. And it's going to have a great effect on the common folks. The Enlightenment was going to have an effect on the intellectual wealthy, but the Great Awakening was more your common folks. And they will state, first Great Awakening, we haven't started talking about the second Great Awakening yet, but they will always tell you, let you know which one. So if it says Great Awakening 1720, Old Lights. These tended to be your wealthy, elderly, old school religious folks who thought all of these crazy emotional religious revivals were scandalous. We are all going to hell because we are getting away from God's word. This stuff, this isn't how it's supposed to be. Listening to Jonathan Edwards and Sinners in the Hands of Angry God, people crying, and people should be pious because they're afraid of God, not because someone's going to convince them. New Lights are typically your younger, poor, less educated people who really got involved in the emotionalism of the Great Awakening and listening to your Whitfields and your Edwards and getting all involved and coming to the church during this emotional 1720s, 1740s Great Awakening. The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was based on two themes. It was based on science and based on human reasoning. People began to believe that you're in control of your own life. Therefore, when more people embrace Enlightenment ideals, less people are actually moving towards religion. Enlightenment ideals were going to replace religion and therefore be a huge threat to your already established churches. Deism is a religion that springs from Enlightenment. Deism is a religion based on reason and free thought. Deism rejected this idea of predestination. Deism believes in this concept of an absent God. God creates us and then steps back and lets us do our own thing, like the clockmaker who builds the clock and then lets the clock run on itself. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson are going to be two of the big names in the deist movement. Here's part of our Great Awakening preachers, the Edwards and the Whitfield. The hellfire and brimstone preachers. We're all sinners in the hands of an angry God, and the hell is paved with the skulls of unbaptized children. Mercantilism, very heavy government control of the economy. And this is what the British policy is going to be to try and take control over their colonies. Navigation Acts, starting in 1660, long short, saying that all trade must go through England. They later add things like the Molasses Act, the Hat Act, the Wool Act, the Iron Act. So initially, these things, everything has to go through England, and they listed enumerated goods. Enumerated goods were simply goods that were specifically spelled out. There were originally 4 enumerated goods that they said had to go through England, to England, and only England. Cotton, indigo, sugar, and tobacco are your 4 original enumerated goods. And as I mentioned, we're going to keep adding more and more. Stono Rebellion, one of the first of our successful slave rebellions in the New World. 1739 in South Carolina, you had a group of 20 slaves, took up arms and tried to head to Spanish-controlled Florida. Along the way, they picked up a total of about 100 of them, and they burned plantations, and they killed some whites, and long short, the Charlestown militia was sent after them and captured them before they reached Spanish-controlled Florida. And to make an example of them, they were decapitated, their heads were put on pikes, and they were put along mile markers all the way back to their owners. James Oglethorpe. James Oglethorpe receives a plot of land from England to try and create some sort of colony that can contribute to the mercantilist policies. Georgia is created by James Oglethorpe as his vision was. It was going to be a haven for debtors. One way to attract people to come to Georgia. Well, that's not really what worked. What worked was you're going to get more middle-class farmers and artisans coming into Georgia. So haven for debtors, and also a buffer zone from the wealthy rice plantations between them and Spanish-controlled Florida. Salutary neglect. This is the British treatment of the American colonists. In other words, they simply ignored them for the most part until about 1763. So salutary neglect, like 1690, even after the Navigation Acts, until 1763. 1763 was the end of the French and Indian War, and this is where the colonists had racked up a lot of debt, and this is where the British Crown was going to take control. Virtual representation. This is the British claim that the colonists were represented simply by being British citizens. So quit your crying about no taxation or representation. Writs of assistance. In an attempt to slow down the smuggling industry, the British passed this idea of legal searches with or without any warrant. Warrantless searches, writs of assistance, to try and, go into people's ships, go into people's homes, look for smuggled goods. Vice Admiralty courts. Courts that were passed for people found guilty of not paying their taxes, smuggling. The punishment of smuggling was going to be execution. And these Vice Admiralty courts were going to be set up where you had a judge that was appointed by the king, you had no jury, and that judge was also going to get a percentage of whatever he found or against you, sorry. European wars and the effect on their colonies. Okay, King William's War was a war between England and France. The effect on the colonies is the Iroquois got slaughtered because the Iroquois were primarily either pro-British or neutral and didn't really pick a side. About 25% of the entire Iroquois population was wiped out. Queen Anne's War is a war between England, with England fighting France and Spain. They were trying to establish who was going to be the dominant country in the New World. England is given some territory in Nova Scotia, and at the end of this war they also are granted some trading rights in Spain. In other words, England wins. King George's War, once again, a war fought between England fighting France and Spain. The significance here is the colonists fought with England, for England, and the colonists actually won some battles. They won. They occupied a French fort, and after claiming this land and being very patriotic about it, the British traded that land away for some territory in India. And so the colonists were really kind of miffed. It was a huge slap in the face for the colonists following King George's War. Another result of King George's War is because the French once again lose, many of the French are going to start leaving the Americas. The Albany Plan of Union. Following these wars, the colonies tried to join together and create a mutual defense pact against the French and against the natives. The plan was you get representatives from every colony that would meet in Albany. Now they all agreed, yes, we should create some sort of military to protect ourselves, but nobody agreed to the tax that would be required to pay for this. So although it failed, it did show that the colonies were now going to consider themselves an idea of a union and start to work together. Join or Die was the cartoon that was produced by Benjamin Franklin in response to the Albany Plan of Union. It was that segmented snake. You know, if we don't join together, we will certainly all die apart. French and Indian War. All right, 1754 to 1763. England and their colonists were going to fight the French and their Native American allies. This whole thing starts over who is going to control the Ohio River Valley. Long short, William Pitt is the guy from England, who becomes prime minister and changes the English military policy and basically saves the day for the British. The English and their American colonists win this war that George Washington and the American colonists started. But the result of this is going to be the British are deeply in debt. That number, I think, was 132 million pounds in debt following the end of this war. So the British are going to have to start getting the colonists to pay their own way, and the only way to do that is to jack up taxes or create unions. Fort Duquesne. This is where General Braddock, British General Braddock, is killed during the French and Indian War. Fort Duquesne is near present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And when Braddock dies, so too does George Washington's hope of ever becoming a commissioned military man in the British Army. Fort Necessity, the fort that was built, well, out of necessity by George Washington after his Native American guy. We'll say inadvertently, because they didn't mean to start the French and Indian War, but nonetheless, splits open the head of a French diplomat, and Washington and the boys have to retreat back, further towards, going east, towards the Appalachian Mountains, knows the French are coming and builds a fort in a valley as the French and natives are just chilling and watching Washington and the boys build this fort. They plan for their attack on the fort, and the night of the planned attack was a horrible torrential rainstorm and washed away the walls of the fort, and Washington is forced to surrender. Fort Necessity on July 4th, 1750. Treaty of Paris is the treaty that officially ends the French and Indian War in 1763. Whenever you see a question about the Treaty of Paris, make sure you look at the date. There are a couple treaties of Paris, but ours for the end of the French and Indian War is 1763. The result of this is the French are gone out of the New World. The British are now going to control all of previously French-controlled New France, present-day Canada, and British territory is now going to go as far west as the Mississippi River. On top of that, England was going to get control of previously Spanish territory, Florida, in return for Cuba. England had occupied Cuba during the war, and they did a little switch. Proclamation Act of 1763. George Grenville is going to be the Prime Minister of England who gets this act pushed through. The proclamation line was going to be a line drawn on the Appalachian Mountains telling the colonists, even though we own all of this territory up to Mississippi, we can't protect you from the Native Americans if you cross this line. So the Proclamation Act was going to make it illegal for the colonists to cross the Appalachian Mountains and settle into this new territory. The colonists basically had a few words for the British and did not abide by this proclamation line and crossed it by hundreds of people. The Sugar Act of 1764 was passed to offset military expenses that had incurred during the French and Indian War. The Sugar Act was going to impose taxes on sugar, coffee, wine, pimentos, a few other things. The Sugar Act is an example of an external tax. An external tax, or taxing of things that were not previously in the colonies, so things that they're going to need to import, a way to raise money. The effect of the Sugar Act on molasses, however, was it did lower the price of molasses. And you remember the Molasses Act, that had part of the navigation to the Jack Jones guy. The response to the Sugar Act was no taxation without representation. And now they're going to start this boycott of British goods. Stamp Act of 1765 places a tax on anything that requires paper, basically. And this one was one that affected everybody. You could not live your life without having to get some sort of deed, license, contract, newspaper, pamphlet, playing cards. Everyone at some point was going to have to pay part of this Stamp Act. Response, colonists are going to start organizing themselves politically, and they formed the Stamp Act Congress. And again, their call of no taxation without representation. There we go, Stamp Act Congress, 1765. Representatives from 9 of our colonies meet and send a resolution or a letter to Parliament simply saying, we love being British citizens, however, we think the Stamp Act thing is ridiculous. It's oppressive, we're not being represented, yada, yada, yada. So sending a letter, letting the Parliament know, once again, organizing themselves politically. External versus internal. Again, external is a tax on things that are not currently in the colonies. Internal, like the Stamp Act, would be a tax on things that are currently in. You can see AP likes to bring this up, this idea of external versus internal. Boycotts. Most of these new revenue-raising measures passed by Grenville are going to lead to this idea of boycotts. Boycotts are also going to lead to the colonists starting to manufacture things for themselves, where previously it had been illegal to do so because of navigations. They were willing to do this under these boycotts. Sons of Liberty, the Sam Adams vigilante group that would pay you a visit if you were caught violating any of these colonial boycotts. Sam and the boys got a little bit crazy, but they were very effective, especially in Boston. Committees of Correspondence, also started by Sam Adams in 1772-ish, I believe. It was the propaganda machine. It made sure that everyone in all of our colonies were well aware of this horrible mistreatment by the British. Propaganda machine. They exaggerated, they did whatever they could to drum up everybody's support throughout the colonies. The Declaratory Act. Benjamin Franklin plays a large role in negotiating with the British and getting them to repeal the Stamp Act, which was a big part of the Declaratory Act. But in repealing the Stamp Act, they also stated that Parliament has the authority over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So we'll give in to your demands this time, except remember, we are still your overlords. The Townshend Revenue Acts. The new treasurer, or exchequer, Charles Champagne Charlie Townshend, was going to convince Parliament to pass new taxes. There are going to be 5 items that Charles Townshend is going to focus on. Lead, paint, paper, glass, and tea. And tea was going to be the one that gets the colonists all fired up. Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, written by John Dickinson, really gets the colonists once again all fired up that these Townshend Acts are still no taxation without representation. The significance is it was to let the farmers know that yes, this affects you too, it affects all of us. The Boston Massacre in March of 1770, as you got about 60 colonists assembling outside of a Boston pub, start heckling and throwing things, snowballs and ice balls and rocks and sticks at, you know, the 10 or so British soldiers that were outside the pub. Long short, the British soldiers end up turning and firing, and you are a group of colonists killing 5 and wounding 6. And again, the propaganda machine was going. This massacre, as they claimed it, where the British soldiers are now killing American colonists. It gets everybody everywhere up and down the coast, as far west as, Pennsylvania, Ohio region, all fired up that the British soldiers were killing the colonists. The Gaspee. The Gaspee was a British revenue ship. In other words, taking a lot of this tax money back to England. It ran aground near Providence, Rhode Island. And when it ran aground, the colonists went out and set the thing on fire. So it's just a very clear indication of the colonists' attitude with the British and their taxes. The Tea Act of 1773, this was passed by Parliament to get the East Indies Tea Company out of bankruptcy. The Crown wants the colonists to purchase this. So what happens, the Tea Act cuts out the middleman. The East Indies Tea Company can now ship directly from the East Indies to the New World without having to stop in England and collect the taxes and incur all the costs. So the result of the Tea Act is it lowers the price of tea in the colonies. The response, the British must be up to something. Even though the price of tea had decreased, the colonists had zero trust for what the British were up to, and still, no matter what, if it's high or low, it is still a tax, and we aren't represented. Leads to our lovely Tea Party in Boston in 1773, where you had a small group of colonists very loosely dress up as Native Americans and board a ship in the Boston harbor that was loaded up with 45 tons of tea, and to show their displeasure, chuck the tea into the harbor. The response is the coercives, or as the colonists called it, the Intolerable Acts that were passed in 1774. So a reaction to the Tea Party. The Boston Port Act was part of this, which closes all ports in Boston until they paid restitution, which they never did. The Massachusetts government, which basically disallows your Massachusetts government. It limited your town meetings to 1 per year, and the governor was now going to be appointed by the king. The Administration of Justice Act, as it was called in England, or as the colonists referred to it, the Murder Act. If any English government official was accused of murder or any other felonies that they were later going to add to it, the trial would be heard in England, not in the Americas. And this is after the Boston Massacre, when John Adams represented these British soldiers, and thought very fairly represented these British soldiers. So they just thought this was a complete travesty of justice. A New Quartering Act is part of the coercives, opening up where the British could be housed. The Quebec Act, which extended the province of Quebec down through the Great Lakes and into the into the Ohio River Valley. So 1, it expands this territory, and 2, it establishes Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, as the official religion in the Quebec territory. And this one freaked out a lot of Americans because of this idea of separation of church and state. They were trying to get away from a state-controlled religion. Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine in 1776. It was a layman's version of why we should break away from the British. People are starting to talk about independence, but a lot of people, farmers, middle class, don't really understand what's going on until Thomas Paine puts this in layman's terms. And he says it's only at this point, only common sense that we declare ourselves as independent. This is January 1776, and it becomes like the bestseller in the colonies. The First Continental Congress was formed in 1774. There were originally 55 delegates, including your John Adams, your Sam Adams, your Thomas Jefferson, your Patrick Henry, your George Washington. The reason they formed this, representatives from 12 of our 13 colonies, was to draw out their argument, their gripes, their grievances against the king. And again, they're showing this political unity amongst all of our colonies here. The majority of them agreed on a couple things. They agreed that the Galloway Plan was not cool. And the Galloway Plan was simply going to create a colonial unity under the British Crown. That was like the really soft version of, okay, let's iron out our differences, let's still agree we're going to be under the crown. When they formed this Continental Congress, they broke into two groups. There were your radicals and there were your moderates. And very quickly, your Sam Adams and your radicals are going to take over. And this is why the Galloway Plan gets shot down. They did approve the Suffolk Plan, S-U-F-F-O-L-K, Suffolk Plan. The Suffolk Plan was going to be this letter to Parliament. And in this letter to Parliament, they're going to say, okay, we understand, Parliament, you have the right to regulate our economy. However, we want to eliminate all legislation that has been passed from 1773 on. And the focus of this was on the coercive or the intolerable acts. Also at the Continental Congress, they agreed they're going to have to form some sort of protection against themselves if necessary, so you get the establishment of the Minutemen. They also established this, what they called the Association. And the Association was going to make sure that it was going to be a complete colonial boycott of all British goods. They also agree they're going to completely ignore like the restitution that the British were calling for the Boston Tea Party. And they said, all right, if all of these things aren't met, then we're going to meet again next spring and try and reassess where we are. So there's our Suffolk Resolution again. Letter to Parliament saying you've got the right to control trade, but we don't like the intolerable acts. It's not fair. Lexington and Concord in April 1775, sorry. On the way to Concord, so you got Boston, Lexington, and then Concord. The British soldiers, the British were on their way to Concord to take what they had heard was where the colonists were storing a lot of their munitions. So on the way to Concord, to get the colonists' supply of munitions, the colonists were like harassing them along the way and hiding from behind trees, and there were some shots fired, a lot of harassment along the way. It was at Lexington where you get an engagement of warfare between the colonists and the British. And this is where they say is the shot heard round the world. The first shots of the Revolution occur at Lexington in Massachusetts, officially by many, beginning our American Revolution. Second Continental Congress, a couple weeks after the Lexington and Concord incident, they thought, well, since our grievances had not been met the first time, let's meet and figure out what we need to do now. So they formed the Second Continental Congress that met in May of 1775. And here's where they send the king another message. Since they haven't heard anything back from their previous message, the Suffolk Resolution, they try again. That trying again they called the Humble Petition, also known as the Olive Branch Petition. The Olive Branch Petition, it sounds very nice and friendly, extending the olive branch to King George III. The Olive Branch Petition basically says, all right, King, we've tried, Parliament sucks, we want a ceasefire in Boston, we want your troops gone, we want the repeal of the coercive acts. We want our rights back. They were a little more firm. And once again, they don't hear anything back from the king. So they have to form these committees. These committees were formed or established in the Second Continental Congress. The committees, two different committees. One to draft some sort of declaration of independence. The other to form the government. If we are going to declare ourselves independent, we're going to have to come up with a system of running things. So Thomas Jefferson is given the lead job, the head guy in this committee to write our Declaration of Independence, and John Dickinson was given the committee head in this position to write a new government. Okay, so there's our Declaration of Independence, which we mentioned, we know that. This kind of lists all of our grievances against the king. There were like 27 gripes we had, and we listed it all in the Declaration of Independence. John Locke's ideas, Locke's Enlightenment ideas of a social contract and natural rights were what we based our entire Declaration of Independence on. Natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and all men are created equal, and this kind of. Okay, well, Locke said property. We didn't like property. You had to have property to be able to vote here. So we tweaked that a little bit. We said, all right, instead of property, we all have the right to be happy. Breed Hill or Bunker Hill. We know it as Bunker Hill because the newspaper incorrectly reported it. The incident actually takes place on Breeds Hill, which is right next to Bunker Hill. These hills were right outside of Boston, and it was a strategic hold for the colonists. So the colonists held these hills. If they hold these hills, they can basically control what's going on in Boston. So as the British soldiers are coming into Boston following what happened at Lexington, they can see what's going on, they can see everything and fire into the city if necessary. So the British understood if they needed to control this hill. So while the colonists were on top, you know, the strategic high ground, the British soldiers are sending waves of troops up this hill to go and capture the colonists. Well, these waves of troops are carrying these packs, with all of their supplies and weapons, and these packs weigh like 100 pounds each. So they're coming up the hills, and the colonists are just sitting at the top of the hill, just picking them off left and right. Casualty numbers, there were over 1,100 casualties for the British, and the colonists had like 311. The colonists eventually lose control of the hill because the British have numbers, pure numbers. Like the third wave of British soldiers finally capture the hill because the colonists literally ran out of ammunition. Like they completely ran out. So the British end up taking control. But this was a huge moral victory because it showed the colonists that, you know what, maybe we can hang with these guys. You get that strategic, that hold early, and perhaps we can hang with these guys. Not bad, huh? All right, this last one here, and I want to go over this question that's on here, this liberty of conscience question. Excuse me. Anybody in here ever heard of liberty of conscience? Good. All right, if you see a question like this, don't freak out, don't panic, don't just pick the first random answer. Think through this. Okay, liberty of conscience. We've already established we have no clue what that means. Was defended by Roger Williams. What do you know about Roger Williams? Separation of church and state. Okay, so you don't know much about liberty of conscience. We know Roger Williams, separation of church and state. What else do you know about Roger Williams? All right, he was a Puritan dissenter and he established? Okay, Rhode Island. So these are the things we know about Roger Williams. Okay. A, all religions were equal in the eyes of God. Does that follow what Roger Williams was stating? Be careful of any words like all. If you are reading, and this goes for any test you ever take, if you see the word all in there, be very careful. Make sure, if you're answering an all, then know that it is all. If you are uncertain, you know, this definitive all, you might want to shy away from it. Okay, so that one, I don't like it. B, the institutions of political democracy would be jeopardized without it. Without what? I don't know, that was a good question. The institutions of political democracy would be jeopardized without, I guess probably without separation of church and state. The institution of political, we don't like it. If you can't make sense out of it, move on. C, Puritan ideas about sin and salvation were outmoded. Puritan ideas about sin and salvation. Does that pertain to Williams? Yeah? Alright, then hold on to that one. Theological truths would emerge from the clash of ideas. Theological truths would emerge from the clash of ideas. Your silence is deafening. Theological truths. Okay, so this is making it sound like there's lots of different religions out there, and eventually out of this, maybe you can get what is really true. All right, no one seems thrilled. The state was an improper and ineffectual agency in matters of the spirit. Yes. Thumbs up. Absolutely. You guys knew nothing about liberty of conscience, but simply knowing something about Roger Williams allowed you to talk yourself through it. Cross off the ones you don't know, leave the others as possible options, and there is no penalty for guessing on these. AP will do it, we will not on these, so please do guess. Thanks. I know it's a lot, and it's quick,
I got 2 pages. Now that I actually have the numbers organized.
and then you can do this.
Yesterday's numbers.
I'm sure it was.
Like, I was 20 numbers. I was on 113 and I ended up on 37. So the numbers are obviously like way off.